When I told my parents I was pregnant, I thought there might be yelling, maybe tears, maybe disappointment, that much I expected. But what I didn't expect was how cold everything would feel, how quickly my whole world would collapse. I was 17. 17 and terrified, holding on to this one moment, hoping that maybe, just maybe, there'd be some kind of warmth or understanding in their eyes. I stood in the middle of our living room, still in my part-time uniform from the grocery store, my hands shaking as I spoke the words out loud, "I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was louder than any scream. My dad, Thomas, had been reading the paper. He didn't even set it down at first. He just looked over the top edge of it like he was seeing something disgusting on the bottom of his shoe. Then, slowly, with this look of complete disgust, he folded the paper, placed it on the coffee table, and stood up. He didn't come toward me. He didn't raise his voice. That almost made it worse. He said, "You're a disgrace to this family," like it was a line he'd rehearsed, like he'd always known he might have to say something like that one day and was relieved he finally got to use it. My mom, Carol, was sitting on the other side of the room. She didn't even turn her head toward me. She kept looking at the wall like she couldn't even bring herself to see me. And when she finally did speak, her voice was flat, dead almost. "You've ruined our reputation." That was all she said. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "Who's the father?" Not, "What are we going to do?" Just that. Like my entire worth to her had always been tied to how other people saw us. They didn't ask questions. They didn't want to understand. They didn't care about how I felt, or how scared I was, or how lonely I'd been carrying that secret. It was like, the moment I told them, I stopped being their daughter and became some kind of infection they needed to cut out. Then my dad looked at the clock on the wall, tapped it with his finger, and said, "You've got 10 minutes. Get your things and leave. Don't come back." I stood there frozen. At first, I didn't believe he meant it. I waited for someone to say it was just the anger talking, for someone to break down and cry, or tell me we'd figure something out. But nothing came. My mom still hadn't looked at me. My dad crossed his arms and watched me, waiting. 10 minutes. That's what they gave me. 10 minutes to decide what parts of my life I could carry and which ones I had to leave behind forever. I ran up to my room, trying to move fast but feeling like I was underwater. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unzip my duffel bag. I grabbed underwear, some jeans, a hoodie. I forgot my toothbrush. I forgot half of my school stuff. I left behind the photo of me and my grandma because I didn't see it on the dresser. I left behind my favorite books, my blanket from when I was a kid, everything that had ever made that house feel like home. I could hear the ticking of the hallway clock as I packed. Each tick was a reminder that I didn't belong there anymore. My parents weren't yelling. They weren't crying. They were just downstairs, waiting for me to disappear like I was a stain they couldn't scrub out fast enough. When I came back down, duffel bag slung over one shoulder, my dad was standing by the door. He opened it without saying a word. My mom still hadn't moved from her spot on the couch. She didn't look at me when I walked past her. She didn't even flinch when the door shut behind me. And that was it. No hug. No goodbye. No be safe. Just silence. A slammed door. And the sharp, hollow sound of it locking behind me. When I first told Brandon I was pregnant, I was shaking so badly I could hardly hold my phone. I didn't want to text it, but I didn't know how else to say it. We'd only been dating for 7 months, but in those 7 months, he'd told me he loved me at least 100 times. He used to brush the hair behind my ear and whisper about how we were going to leave the city behind, start over somewhere warm, somewhere no one knew us. He talked about buying a house with a porch swing, about me finishing school, and how he'd find a job and take care of everything. And I believed him. I was young, but not stupid. I knew life didn't always go as planned. Still, when someone looks you in the eyes and promises forever, it's hard not to hold on to that like it's something real. So when I sent that message, telling him I was late and had taken 3 tests that all said the same thing, I held my breath and waited for the typing dots to appear. They never did. I waited an hour. Then 2. Then a day. I called him 3 times that night and each one went straight to voicemail. By the end of the week, he had blocked me on everything. Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook, my number, gone. Like I had never existed. I was already homeless. My parents had kicked me out the week before when I told them. I was living night to night, wherever I could find shelter, but that week, I ran out of couches and favors. The air was starting to cool down, and Dallas nights, even in late fall, could make your teeth chatter if you weren't layered up. I had a single duffel bag with some clothes and a few dollars in coins that I kept in a side pocket. No phone charger, no jacket thick enough for sleeping outside, and definitely no plan. Every night, I wandered to places where there were lights, where maybe I wouldn't get robbed or worse. A few nights, I found myself in a corner of a hospital waiting room, pretending I was waiting for someone. But eventually they'd ask questions, and I'd have to leave. I started sleeping on benches. Some were in small parks, some near bus stations. I picked spots where there were cameras nearby, not because anyone would come help me if something happened, but because it made me feel like maybe I mattered a little bit more if someone was watching. I'd tuck my bag under my arm and curl up as small as I could, trying to ignore the sounds of cars, of sirens, of people yelling down the street. One night, a man sat down beside me, said nothing, just sat there for 10 minutes and then walked away. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Every minute felt like an hour. A few days after Brandon disappeared, I got a letter. It was delivered to the front desk of the community center where I sometimes went during the day to use the bathroom and charge my phone if they let me. I didn't recognize the envelope, but when I opened it, my hands started shaking again. It was from his parents. I had only met them once, and they hadn't said much, but now they were speaking through a lawyer. A formal document, full of legal language I barely understood, stating that their son, Brandon Foster, had never met me, had no relationship with me, and wanted no further contact. There was a line that said any claims made by me were categorically denied and that if I attempted to contact him again, I could be subject to legal action. I sat there on the floor of that community center bathroom, the letter crumpling in my hands, tears sliding down my face silently. I didn't even have enough left in me to cry out loud. I had thought the worst part was behind me. I thought getting kicked out by my parents was the bottom. But this was something else. It was being erased. Not just abandoned, but wiped away like I was a mistake no one wanted to claim. I had no one left. I stopped going to school. I couldn't focus anyway, and the smell on my clothes started to make people shift away from me on the bus when I could afford the ride. I was alone, pregnant, and terrified, wandering the streets of a city that didn't care if I lived or died. Every promise Brandon made meant nothing. Every I love you had turned into silence. And every night, as I lay curled up on a bench with my arms wrapped around my stomach, I told myself that I had to survive, even if it was just out of spite. Because no one else was going to care if I did. It was just after 6 in the morning when the sky was still more gray than blue and the sidewalks of downtown Dallas were damp from a light drizzle that had passed through the night. I was curled up on the cold concrete just outside a small cafe on Elm Street, the kind of place that looked expensive inside even though the windows were fogged up from the warmth inside meeting the chill of the outside air. My arms were wrapped tightly around my middle, trying to protect the small life growing inside me, though I could feel the thin fabric of my hoodie doing little against the wind that cut through the streets like blades. I had barely slept. My back ached from the unforgiving ground, and my throat was sore from the dry air and not enough water. I had spent most of the night pacing the blocks nearby, trying to keep moving so I wouldn't freeze, but exhaustion won out somewhere around 4 a.m., and I collapsed beside the cafe, hoping I wouldn't get kicked awake. I was almost drifting again when I felt a shadow fall over me. At first, I tensed, expecting to be told to leave or worse. But instead of a harsh voice or the click of someone's heels passing quickly by, I heard a soft, deliberate voice say, "Sweetheart, are you okay?" I opened my eyes slowly, squinting against the light that was just starting to rise, and saw an older woman standing above me. She was maybe in her 60s, with short silver hair tucked under a knit hat and a red wool coat that looked both warm and expensive. Her face was lined, but her eyes were sharp, like she missed nothing. She didn't look afraid of me. She didn't look disgusted. She looked concerned, genuinely, without a trace of pity. I tried to sit up quickly, embarrassed, and murmured something about being fine, just waiting for a ride, but my voice cracked halfway through the lie. She didn't press. She didn't ask the questions I'd come to dread. Instead, she reached into her bag and handed me a paper cup. It was warm, and the smell of black coffee hit me like a lifeline. I wrapped my fingers around it, soaking in the heat. Then she handed me a bag with a sandwich in it. Still warm, too. Egg and cheese, I think. I don't remember tasting it because I ate it so fast it barely touched my tongue, but I remember how the warmth settled in my stomach like a reminder that I was still human. After I finished eating, she sat down next to me. Not above me, not standing like I was a problem to be managed, she sat right there on the concrete, brushing away a bit of dampness with her glove and lowering herself down like it was the most natural thing in the world. Her name was Janice. She introduced herself with a small smile and didn't ask for mine right away. She said she passed by this cafe every morning before it opened, on her way to walk her dog, and that she had noticed me a few times before. I hadn't seen her, I was usually too focused on staying invisible, but something about the way she said it made me believe she was telling the truth. She wasn't just seeing me now. She had seen me. She asked if I had somewhere to go. I hesitated. I was tired of lying, and even more tired of the truth. I finally said no, not really, but I was figuring it out. She nodded slowly, like she understood more than I was saying, and then asked me if I'd come with her for the day. Just for the day, she said. A shower, a warm place to sit, maybe a nap on a real couch. No pressure. Just comfort, if I wanted it. And I hesitated, of course I did, because every part of me had been trained by the last few weeks to expect every hand extended toward me to be a trap. But something in her eyes, calm, steady, like she wasn't trying to fix me or save me, made me say yes. Her house was about a 10-minute walk away. It was modest but beautiful in a way that told you someone cared deeply about it. There were wind chimes on the porch and old books stacked in corners of the living room. The scent of cinnamon hung in the air, faint but welcoming. She gave me a towel and some clothes, simple things, sweatpants and a soft long-sleeve shirt, and pointed me toward the bathroom. I took the longest shower I had in weeks, maybe months. I cried quietly while the water ran over me, cried until there were no more tears left. When I came out, she had made soup. Chicken and rice, with crackers on the side. She didn't ask questions while I ate. She just sat across from me with a book in her hands, letting the silence be warm instead of heavy. That night, she asked if I wanted to stay. Just one night. Then another. She never made me feel like I was a burden. She had rules, yes, respect, honesty, small things that made the space feel safe, not restrictive. Over the next few days, I began to see that her kindness wasn't about charity. It wasn't about feeling sorry for me or checking some moral box. She saw something in me I hadn't seen in myself for a long time. Not just a scared girl on the edge of survival, but someone who could rebuild, who still had pieces worth saving. And slowly, I started to believe her. Because Janice didn't give me everything, I didn't suddenly have a new life handed to me on a silver platter. But she gave me the one thing I had forgotten existed, a chance. A warm meal, a safe place to rest, and the quiet, steady belief that I was not beyond saving. When I first learned that Janice owned an entire hotel chain, I was stunned into silence. It wasn't just one hotel or some inherited business sitting on autopilot, she had built it herself from the ground up, starting with a rundown in outside San Antonio and slowly transforming it into a sleek, thriving network of boutique hotels that stretched across 3 states. I had been living in her guest room for a little over a week when she finally told me. She said it casually, over breakfast, like it was no big deal, like it wasn't the most shocking sentence I'd heard since my parents threw me out. I remember blinking at her, the fork halfway to my mouth, and asking, "Wait, you own them?" She smiled, took a sip of her coffee, and said, "Darling, I don't just own them. I built them. And I'm going to teach you how to build yours." At first, I thought she was speaking in metaphors. I was just trying to survive, to stop waking up every morning with dread pooling in my stomach. But Janice didn't believe in survival as a final goal. She believed in power. She believed in making people regret underestimating you. And she had plans for me, clear, sharp-edged, strategic plans. She started small. She got me a job in the front lobby of one of her hotels in East Dallas, a sleek, glass-walled place with minimalist design and high-end guests who wore tailored suits and demanded the impossible with a smile. My job title was hostess, but Janice made it clear from the beginning that this was just the beginning. She told me I'd start at the front desk, but not to get comfortable. "Watch everyone," she said. "Watch how they speak. How they lie. How they charm. Most people show you exactly who they are if you know what to look for." And so I watched. I memorized check-in procedures and customer preferences. I noticed how the night manager deflected complaints with fake empathy, how the concierge adjusted his body language depending on the wealth of the guest. I learned who the real decision-makers were even when they didn't look the part. And Janice watched me right back. Every week she'd meet with me in her office, go over what I saw, what I understood, and then she'd quiz me, not on the logistics of the job, but on the people. Then the real training began. Janice started handing me books. Not the kind you find on cheap self-help shelves, but dense texts on business strategy, psychological manipulation, high-level management theory, and financial planning. I spent every free moment reading, sometimes in the back office during slow shifts, sometimes on her living room floor late into the night. She'd throw out questions while pouring wine or fixing her hair in the mirror. What's the first rule of negotiation? Why do desperate people lose in business? How do you spot fear in a boardroom? It wasn't school. It was war preparation. She moved me into different roles over the months, assistant to the operations manager, then shadowing her personal executive team. She made me sit in on budget meetings, marketing strategy calls, even vendor contract negotiations. At first, I was terrified of saying the wrong thing. But she didn't shield me. She'd let me speak, make mistakes, then pull me aside later and break it all down. That hesitation cost you 10% leverage, she'd say. You apologized too much, never show your belly. Her words were sharp, not cruel, but unapologetically exact. She didn't coddle. She refined. Janice wasn't just teaching me how to make money, she was teaching me how to dismantle every illusion that had kept me weak. She taught me that loyalty was earned, not begged for, and that no one who left you to rot on the street deserved your forgiveness. She reminded me often, in her calm, ice-edged tone, the people who discarded you did so because they thought you had nothing to offer. So make yourself undeniable. Then she'd pause, let the silence stretch, and add, and when they come crawling back, because they will, you don't open the door. You burn the house down. What started as survival became strategy. I changed how I walked, how I spoke, how I dressed. She took me shopping one afternoon, brought me to a tailor and said, dress like you own the place, even if you're mopping the floors. I began to notice the shift almost immediately. Guests stopped brushing me off. Managers started watching me more carefully. People leaned in when I spoke. Janice smiled every time she noticed it, like a coach watching their fighter land the first real punch. But she always brought it back to the foundation. Empire, she'd say, isn't about owning property. It's about owning yourself. Every room you walk into, you take control. You don't ask permission to exist. You don't chase people. You let them feel the weight of your absence when you leave. You let them wonder how they ever thought they could forget you. And I listened. I listened with the desperation of someone who had once had nothing but shame and hunger. I soaked it all in, every word, every technique, every lesson about leverage and silence and the power of composure. Janice taught me that revenge wasn't always loud. Sometimes it looked like success wrapped in silk and steel. And sometimes the best way to get even was to rise so far above those who abandoned you that they could no longer reach your name, let alone your forgiveness. The miscarriage happened in early spring, just as the weather in Dallas was starting to shift from brittle cold mornings to the kind of soft, humid air that wrapped around your skin like a second layer. I was a little over 3 months in, still early enough that most people wouldn't have noticed, but far enough along that I had memorized every stage of development and had already started sleeping with my hand resting protectively over my stomach each night. The day it happened, I woke up to a dull ache in my lower back, the kind I had felt before during rough periods, but I told myself it was normal. Stress, maybe. Fatigue. I had been pushing myself harder than usual, training, studying, proving myself, but I wasn't about to slow down. I thought if I could just hold on a little longer, things would settle. The pain didn't settle. It grew sharper as the day wore on. By afternoon, I was in the employee restroom at one of Janice's hotels, clutching the edge of the sink, trying to breathe through it while sweat slid down my spine. When I saw the blood, bright and horrifying against the inside of my thigh, I went numb. I didn't scream. I didn't cry right away. I just stared. Somewhere in my mind, I already knew what was happening, but denial has a strange way of numbing the body before the truth can shatter you. I don't remember how I got to the hospital. One of the staff must have found me, or maybe I called Janice, I genuinely don't know. The memories of that day come in jagged, disjointed fragments: white lights in the ER, a nurse with tired eyes, the cold pressure of an ultrasound wand, the sterile voice of a doctor confirming what I already knew before he even finished the sentence. There was no heartbeat. There was no baby anymore. I blamed myself instantly. I blamed the nights I'd spent sleeping on concrete, the hunger, the cold, the screaming rejection from my parents, the stress of Brandon ghosting me, and the letters from his lawyers. I blamed the long shifts, the emotional exhaustion, the weight of everything I had tried to hold together while my insides quietly gave up. And I hated myself for not being able to protect the one thing I had promised I would. When Janice arrived at the hospital, she didn't speak at first. She just sat beside me in the dull, humming silence of the recovery room and held my hand. I remember turning my face away from her, ashamed that I had failed at something so fundamental. I expected her to tell me to rest, to say something polite about time healing wounds, but she didn't. She just squeezed my hand and said, quietly and firmly, "You didn't break. The world tried to break you. That's not the same thing." It took me weeks to fully process the loss. I returned to work, but everything felt heavier, quieter. I had been carrying hope inside me, a tiny, growing piece of possibility, and now there was just silence where that heartbeat should have been. I moved through my days like someone watching their life from the outside. I wasn't sure if I would ever feel grounded again. But Janice, in the way only she could, refused to let me collapse inward. She gave me space when I needed it, and then, when the time was right, she brought up the idea of adoption. Not as a replacement. Not as some kind of quick fix. But as a continuation of the life I had planned to build, a step forward instead of a step back. "If you still want to be a mother," she said, "then you will be. Not because you have to be. Because you choose to be." It took months. The process was grueling, invasive, full of paperwork and interviews and inspections, and even with Janice's name and network smoothing some of the bureaucratic friction, it was still exhausting. But through it all, I felt something return, a sense of direction, of determination. I wasn't chasing what I had lost. I was creating something new, something deliberate. And when I was finally matched with a newborn baby boy, I knew without hesitation that he was mine. He had a full head of dark hair and eyes that scanned the room like he was trying to memorize everything all at once. I named him Dallas. Not because the city held good memories. It didn't. It had chewed me up, spit me out, left me bleeding and alone on sidewalks and benches and hospital beds. But I named him Dallas because he was proof that even in a place that nearly broke me, something could survive. Something could grow. He became my reason to wake up, to push harder, to think further ahead. He became part of the plan, not a detour, not a burden, but the anchor I hadn't realized I needed. Janice didn't treat him like a footnote, either. She welcomed him into her home with the same steel-edged grace she carried into boardrooms. She bought him blankets and bottles and toys, but more than that, she treated him like legacy. She told me once, while watching me rock him to sleep in the living room, "This is what they can't take from you. They tried to reduce you to nothing, and now you have everything." And she was right. I hadn't just survived. I had planted something in the ashes. From the moment I brought Dallas home, I knew I wasn't just raising a child, I was shaping a force. He wasn't going to be a passive participant in life, drifting through it like so many others who lived by circumstance. He was going to understand the weight of his mind, the reach of his skills, and the way the world truly worked beneath its polished surface. I didn't want him to be soft or naive, and I certainly didn't want him to be at the mercy of anyone the way I once was. I wanted him to be sharper than anyone expected, faster than anyone could follow, and prepared for every level of the game before the world even knew he was playing. By the time he was 4, he was reading faster than most adults I knew. I noticed the way his eyes tracked everything, how he studied patterns, how he asked questions that cut deeper than they should have for someone his age. I never used baby talk with him. I spoke to him like he was already part of the adult world, because one day, he would be. I didn't shelter him from complexity, I explained it. I let him sit beside me during strategy meetings when Janice allowed it, not because I needed a babysitter, but because I wanted him to absorb the language of power, the rhythms of negotiation, the sharp pauses people used when they were trying to gain leverage. He absorbed it all in silence, like a sponge dropped in oil. When he turned 6, I enrolled him in his first coding camp. It wasn't one of those basic, cartoonish weekend programs designed to teach kids how to drag and drop blocks into preset puzzles. This was an immersive boot camp in Austin run by ex-engineers who didn't care how old you were as long as you could keep up. The first few days, he struggled. He cried once, silently, in the back seat on the drive home, his jaw tight and his fists clenched. I didn't coddle him. I asked if he wanted to quit. He shook his head. The next morning, he woke up before I did, fully dressed with his laptop in his backpack. By the end of that first session, his instructors were asking where I'd found him. From that point on, there was no slowing him down. He went from basic logic structures to building his own applications before he was 10. I made sure he learned not just how to code, but how to think in systems, how to see the flaws in processes, how to reverse engineer inefficiency. I had him shadow Janice's IT director during summer breaks, and when that wasn't enough, I hired private tutors from overseas to teach him machine learning models and back-end infrastructure development. He didn't just learn software. He mastered it. He learned how to architect platforms from the ground up, how to manipulate user interfaces to maximize conversion, how to optimize performance across networks under heavy load. But I also made sure his mind wasn't locked in front of a screen. I trained him in human dynamics, just like Janice had done with me. He read behavioral economics, took negotiation workshops disguised as teen leadership courses, and watched hours of recorded meetings and depositions, breaking down tone, timing, and body language. He knew how to spot a lie before someone had fully formed it in their mouth. He knew how to ask questions that disarmed people into honesty. He was polite, but never submissive. Charming, but calculating. I didn't raise a robot, I raised a strategist. By 17, he had designed and built a fully integrated hotel operations management system, streamlining staffing, automating inventory controls, integrating booking analytics, and centralizing vendor performance tracking. It wasn't some school project. It was enterprise-grade. Janice let him pilot it in 3 of her smaller locations. Within 6 months, it had saved her chain over $3 million in operating costs. He was 17 and already reshaping an industry that had ignored him because of his age and anonymity. And we kept it that way on purpose. No press releases. No LinkedIn profile. No company website with his name or face. Everything was buried behind shell corporations and non-disclosure agreements. I made sure he understood the power of invisibility. While other kids were chasing followers and likes, Dallas was studying systems failure in Fortune 500 companies and tracking how minor tech upgrades could unseat entire executive teams. We let him work in the shadows, because when the time came, his debut wouldn't be for applause, it would be for impact. He wasn't just a prodigy. He was a weapon. Polished. Precise. Untraceable, until we decided otherwise. When we finally decided to go public with Dallas's work, it wasn't a celebration, it was strategy. Every move was calculated, every headline planned. We didn't submit a press release or arrange a press conference. We leaked it, deliberately and precisely, to the right people at the right time. A quiet tip to a mid-tier business tech blog that we knew was hungry for an exclusive, followed by an anonymous data package, screenshots, system benchmarks, financial impact reports from Janice's hotels, all without names attached, just a hint of intrigue and enough technical proof to get the attention of anyone who mattered. The first article came out on a Wednesday morning. It was short, but sharp, titled, "Anonymous Teen Developer Quietly Disrupts Hotel Management Software." Within 48 hours, it exploded. Bigger outlets picked it up, Fast Company, TechCrunch, Wired. One of them tracked the trail back to Janice's chain, then to her, and then, finally, to Dallas. His name was suddenly everywhere. 17-year-old software prodigy transforms hospitality industry. The boy who saved hotels millions before graduating high school. Teen CEO rumors swirl as revolutionary platform gains momentum. Photos from a staged candid at one of the hotel lobbies were published. He wore a charcoal button-down, no tie, sleeves rolled just enough to look intentional, standing in front of a monitor displaying performance dashboards he'd built from scratch. Every inch of it had been prepared in advance, down to the font on the interface. The media ate it up. I watched the headlines unfold in real time, not with pride, but with precision. This wasn't about fame. It was about signal. I knew exactly who would be watching. It took 3 days. On the 3rd morning, while I was in the kitchen pouring coffee, a package arrived at the door. Unmarked box, no note, no return address. I knew before I even opened it. I stood there for a minute just staring at the seal. Then I tore it open, and inside, wrapped neatly in glossy red tissue paper, was a tablet. New, top of the line, untouched. The startup screen lit up the second I pressed the power button, and there it was, a custom lock screen with white serif font against a navy background. To our brilliant grandson, your talent makes this family proud. I stared at it without blinking. The coffee on the counter went cold behind me. I held the tablet in both hands, as if by doing so I could feel the weight of their nerve, their audacity. Thomas and Carol hadn't spoken my name in over 17 years. They hadn't asked if I was alive, hadn't wondered if the child they exiled had survived childbirth, homelessness, grief. Not a single call. Not 1 ounce of remorse. But now that the world knew his name, now that their last name could have been connected to the boy genius on every tech platform in the country, they decided to reappear. With a gift. They thought a shiny object would earn them a place at the table they had once slammed the door on. They thought Dallas would be too young to see the truth, or maybe they assumed I hadn't told him. But I had. I told him everything, not to poison him, but to prepare him. He knew who they were. He knew what they had done. I closed the box, walked out to the front porch where the delivery driver had left the packaging label crumpled near the step, and slid the whole thing back inside the shipping envelope. I didn't attach a note. I didn't need to. I walked into the nearest post office, handed it to the clerk, and gave them the sender's address, because I knew exactly where it came from, even if they tried to be clever. Same house. Same handwriting. Same scent of polished hypocrisy. It was returned that afternoon. Let them read the headlines. Let them see Dallas on every screen, shaking hands with CEOs and speaking at conferences. Let them feel the bitterness of being on the outside, not because they were denied, but because they were forgotten. Not erased, just irrelevant. Their time had passed. The boy they once refused to acknowledge would never need them. And I made damn sure they knew it. After the tablet arrived, wrapped in glossy paper with that pathetic inscription, "To our brilliant grandson," and I sent it back without a word, the silence from my parents didn't hold for long. It transformed into something more sinister, more methodical. I knew them too well to believe that tablet was some spontaneous act of remorse. It wasn't guilt. It was strategy. Calculated, like everything they'd ever done when the family image was at stake. I had seen it in their eyes years ago when they stood in that living room and told me I had ruined them. This wasn't about healing wounds or making amends. They saw a way back in. They saw headlines. They saw power. They saw Dallas. Janice understood immediately. That was one of the things I'd come to admire most about her. She never underestimated people's capacity for manipulation, especially when money or legacy were involved. One night, over a quiet dinner in her study, she pushed aside her wine glass and said, "Let's give them just enough rope to hang themselves." She didn't even need to say their names. We both knew who she meant. That's when we activated the real team, not assistants, not hotel staff, but Janice's inner circle. These were the people who didn't advertise their skill sets, whose names rarely appeared on official company records but who had been instrumental in building Janice's empire behind the scenes. They were discreet, elite, and absolutely lethal in their precision. Marcus came first, her personal attorney for over 2 decades. He didn't smile, didn't waste time with pleasantries. He had the kind of presence that made even confident men second-guess themselves. He sat across from me in Janice's office, tapping a Mont-Blanc pen against a leather notebook, and asked for every name, every detail, every connection. Parents. Extended relatives. Brandon. His parents. The lawyers who had served me the disavowal papers. He laid out a whiteboard and mapped it all like a crime scene, each name connected with red lines, timelines, inheritance clauses, public and private records. In a few hours, he had the skeleton of a legal web that went back nearly 20 years. Then Ivy joined us. She was the digital ghost, the quiet woman who always wore neutral colors and carried a tablet like it was an extension of her nervous system. Ivy had a degree in computer science and a reputation that had gotten her quietly banned from several high-stakes poker tournaments after she exposed an illegal card-counting algorithm no one else had even detected. She didn't talk much, but when she did, every word mattered. Ivy set up a network that monitored every traceable activity tied to my parents' digital identities, their main emails, burner accounts, phone metadata, even their search history when they logged into unsecured public Wi-Fi. She used completely legal tools, exploiting public information most people didn't even realize they were giving away. It was like watching a magician strip someone's privacy away one layer at a time. Within days, we had visibility into everything. Marcus discovered that my parents, Thomas and Carol, had been quietly updating their estate documents over the past 12 months. Through a series of legal maneuvers that involved revocable trusts and family holding companies, they had begun drafting conditional provisions that would allow a named grandchild to receive an inheritance, even if the parent, me, had been legally estranged. It was a workaround. An ugly, twisted legal maneuver to reintroduce Dallas into their financial legacy without having to acknowledge what they had done to me. It was pure optics. A PR cleanse. They wanted their surname on something genius, something powerful, something that would ensure their reputation didn't die out in their suburban neighborhood behind white fences and manicured lawns. At the same time, Ivy surveillance revealed a flurry of activity. My father had created a new Gmail account under the alias TomInvestor3 and used it to register on several business forums, specifically those discussing young tech entrepreneurs and angel investments. My mother, using a similar burner under Carol T's legacy, had signed up for newsletters from emerging family legacy funds and youth innovation grants. They were trying to understand how to monetize proximity to Dallas, how to position themselves as visionary supporters, maybe even reclaim the narrative as long-suffering grandparents who had reconnected with their daughter in the wake of tragedy. They even hired a media consultant. Marcus flagged the payment within 24 hours, a retainer to a small PR firm known for managing legacy rebranding for public figures who had fallen from grace. I looked at the invoice and saw line items that made my stomach turn. Narrative rehabilitation. Family crisis positioning. High-achieving youth affiliation. My parents weren't coming back because they missed me. They were coming back because Dallas was now worth millions, and they wanted to draft behind him like parasites chasing relevance. Then came the Brandon connection. I had tried not to think of him for years. Brandon had ghosted me the moment I told him I was pregnant, then hid behind his parents' lawyers who scrubbed his name from my life with such aggression it felt like a second exile. I never reached out again. I never tried to chase him down for child support or acknowledgement. I didn't want anything from him. But now, thanks to Ivy, we had proof that my parents did. They reached out to him using coded language. It started through an old mutual friend, then shifted into direct contact. One message read, "There may be legal paths for biological rights, especially with underage intellectual assets." Another said, "If we position this carefully, there's value to be shared." They were trying to bait him, to convince him that his long-forgotten connection to me and Dallas could be leveraged into financial or reputational gain. It was disgusting. But not surprising. So we flipped the script. We allowed just enough information to bleed out, carefully curated and time-released. Ivy planted anonymized success metrics of Dallas's software platform on investor forums, baiting speculation. Marcus worked behind the scenes to tighten our legal defenses, ensuring every message we received became potential evidence. And I stayed quiet. I didn't answer their emails. I didn't respond to their messages. I watched them scramble for leverage, for a foothold, for any way to insert themselves into the empire I had built from nothing. We let them think they were being clever, that they were outmaneuvering us. They thought we were naive. They thought their years of silence and betrayal could be paved over with a few gifts, some vague apologies, and the promise of a last name Dallas didn't even share. They had no idea they were walking into a surveillance grid so tight that every click, every call, every conversation they had about us was logged, timestamped, and categorized. I remember one night, sitting in Janice's den with the lights low and the monitors glowing, Ivy scrolling through a flagged email from my father titled Claim Strategy. It was full of phrases like narrative control and soft reconciliation. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there and watched the lie unfold. These were the same people who told me I had ruined their lives. The same people who shut the door in my face when I needed them most. Now they wanted a seat at my table. And we were going to let them walk right into it. Because sometimes the most satisfying revenge isn't in confrontation, it's in precision. It's in letting them believe they're winning right up until the moment they realize they were never even in the game. Once we had them all exposed and under quiet surveillance, every move mapped, every message logged, it was time to take the next step. Watching them circle Dallas like vultures was no longer enough. They wanted back in. They wanted access, recognition, and most of all, control. And I was done playing defense. Janice always said, divide first, then destroy. Let them cannibalize each other while you stay silent, untouched. So I started planting seeds. Not lies, not quite. Just suggestions. Just enough truth wrapped in doubt to let their own suspicions rot the rest. It began with a tip. I created a new identity through an encrypted server, scrubbed of any metadata, then crafted a short, precise message and sent it to Brandon's parents through a routed inbox. It said, "You might want to look into the bank activity. Your son's been in contact with the Greys. Rumors say he's already moved to secure his own stake." I knew how they operated, financial first, emotional second. The Greys were an old competitor of theirs in the real estate space, and the mention alone would be enough to set off alarms. Ivy monitored their inbox as the email landed. We watched them open it, read it twice, then forwarded to Brandon without a word. 2 days later, I sent another tip. This one aimed directly at Brandon. They're rewriting their trust. Reducing outside exposure. You're not listed in the final version. No source, no signature. Just enough to trigger every buried insecurity I knew he still carried from being a pawn in his parents' legal maneuvers back when I was pregnant. Brandon had always been weak to perceived betrayal. He didn't need proof to react. He just needed the possibility. And it worked. The infighting didn't just begin, it detonated. Ivy watched the emails escalate in real time. Brandon's tone turned defensive, then accusatory. He demanded copies of the family estate revisions. His mother, in turn, accused him of being easily manipulated by outside forces. His father hinted at freezing access to one of his accounts until certain concerns were addressed. Brandon pushed back harder, claiming he'd been approached by a media contact who knew more than they should. He threatened to speak publicly. His parents panicked. They sent a flurry of messages to lawyers, trying to reaffirm confidentiality agreements they hadn't even formalized yet. We had them on their heels, paranoid, spiraling. While they tore at each other, we watched their calls come in, first emails, then voicemails, then frantic texts, each one more desperate than the last. Ivy recorded everything. "Please, let's just talk. We want to understand what Dallas needs. We're family. We should be involved." The wording shifted slowly from warm to litigious. One message from my mother arrived at 3 a.m, filled with punctuation errors and half-sentences, like she was too agitated to type properly. "We have rights. Grandparents' rights. Legacy inheritance rights. Visitation. He has our blood. We will sue if we have to." Perfect. They had taken the bait entirely. Every ounce of civility peeled away, revealing the desperation underneath. They no longer cared about pretense or diplomacy. They were grasping. And when people grasp, they make mistakes. Legal ones. Public ones. Ones you can use against them in ways they don't see coming. We compiled everything. Marcus cataloged every message, every call, every veiled threat. He began quietly drafting a response strategy, not to de-escalate, but to escalate precisely. Controlled exposure. Selective leaks. Strategic legal filings if necessary. It was all lining up exactly as planned. The brilliance of the trap wasn't that we tricked them into turning on each other, it was that they were already ready to. All they needed was a nudge. All they needed was the illusion that someone else was ahead of them, that they might lose a share of the power they believed they were entitled to. Their hunger did the rest. The egos they'd spent decades cultivating were now weaponized against each other. I didn't need to fabricate enemies. I just reminded them that loyalty was never really part of their equation. I never responded to their threats. Not once. Every time another message came through, claiming they'd take me to court, claiming Dallas had a right to know his family, I simply archived it and smiled. Let them talk about rights. Let them threaten to sue for visitation to a child they never asked about until they saw his name in the media. Let them scream into the void they built when they locked their door behind me 17 years ago. I wasn't scared of their lawyers. I had Janice. I had Marcus. And more importantly, I had every one of their intentions captured, timestamped, and ready to be dragged into the light. They had already lost. They just hadn't realized the extent of it yet. They finally sued. After weeks of posturing, veiled threats, and increasingly desperate calls and emails, my parents filed an official lawsuit in a Texas district court. They were demanding grandparent visitation rights, a petition to evaluate guardianship structure, and a deeply delusional claim to a partial stake in Dallas's intellectual property, arguing that, as his blood relatives, they had a right to participate in any legacy planning involving his future. The documents were loaded with language engineered to sound compassionate, phrases like reunification, interest in familial well-being, and multi-generational support. But beneath the legal fluff, it was all about control. Control of Dallas, of his image, of his future success, and, by extension, mine. The irony was almost too much to bear. These were the same people who had kicked me out at 17. Who had told me, through cold eyes and clenched jaws, that I was a disgrace. Who locked their door and never opened it again. The same people who, for 2 decades, acted as if I had died the moment I said the word pregnant. And now that the boy they tried to pretend didn't exist was on the front page of tech magazines, they wanted to lay claim to him like he was a lost inheritance they just discovered in a safety deposit box. But they weren't prepared for what we had built. And they were definitely not prepared for what we were about to do. Marcus filed a countersuit less than 24 hours later. It was long, surgical, and devastating. We accused them of attempted defamation, malicious interference in business relations, exploitation of a minor for financial gain, and, most importantly, of fraudulent concealment of prior legal documents they had signed, documents that made their current claims not just irrelevant, but legally invalid. He attached dozens of pages of supporting documentation, including transcripts of voicemails, emails retrieved through metadata mapping, and timelines Ivy had compiled showing their communications with Brandon, various PR consultants, and anonymous shell accounts designed to manipulate public perception. Still, we knew that legal battles could be dragged out. My parents had resources. Brandon's family had legal muscle. Even a perfect case could be tied up in hearings and motions for years. So we planned something bigger. Something public. Something final. The Dallas Tech Expo was only 2 weeks away. It was the largest innovation and enterprise software conference in the southern United States, with over 10,000 attendees, broadcast globally, and covered by every major business media outlet. Dallas had been invited to close the event with the keynote speech, a 17-year-old self-taught software architect responsible for revolutionizing real-time operations across the hospitality industry. The youngest speaker in the history of the conference. It was the moment his name would go global. And we turned it into a war room. Janice reserved a VIP suite at the venue, rented an external communications team for the day, and brought in every member of our inner circle. Marcus ran the legal prep. Ivy handled the technical presentation. I coordinated the delivery of the materials. Every sentence of the presentation was revised, timed, and rehearsed. This wasn't going to be a speech. It was going to be a courtroom ambush, public, undeniable, irreversible. The night of the keynote, the room was standing room only. Industry titans filled the front rows. Journalists and cameras were already rolling before Dallas even stepped onto the stage. He wore a navy blue suit with a matte black dress shirt, no tie. Clean. Confident. Every detail had been thought out, down to the way his slides would fade in and how long the opening applause would take to die down. He began with his system, how he built it, why it worked, how he saw inefficiencies no one else had addressed. He gave real numbers. Real impact. Real metrics. He had the room hooked. People were nodding, leaning forward, typing quotes on their tablets. It was flawless. And then he paused. He looked up from the podium, hand steady, voice calm, and said, "Before I finish, I want to speak about something personal. Something about legacy. About ownership. About truth." The screen behind him went black. Then, slowly, a document appeared in full-screen resolution. The header was sharp, the language unmistakable. Voluntary relinquishment of parental rights and future claims, Emily Whitaker and all offspring. Signed, July 14, 2003. Signatories, Thomas Whitaker and Carol Whitaker. The room went still. Dallas read the opening paragraph out loud, his voice unwavering. "We, the undersigned, hereby and forever relinquish all parental rights, responsibilities, entitlements, and claims related to Emily Whitaker and any children born to her now or in the future. This release is permanent, irrevocable, and enforceable under Texas Family Code." He let the silence stretch. Behind him, Ivy cued a second slide, a time-stamped video deposition from 22 years ago. My mother's voice, flat and cold, played through the auditorium. We no longer acknowledge Emily or any consequences of her behavior. She has forfeited her place in this family. Then my father, we consider any resulting child her responsibility alone. This matter is closed. Dallas didn't blink. The individuals who signed this document are the same people currently suing me for access to my life, my intellectual property, and my financial future. Gasps rippled through the room. Phones shot up, flashes popped, whispers spread like fire. Another slide appeared, screenshots of recent emails from my parents to Brandon, with subject lines like legal strategy for partial claim and controlling the legacy story. Then banking transactions to a boutique PR firm with invoice labels such as narrative rehabilitation and family reintegration campaign. Ivy had watermarked every file with metadata showing their origin, authenticity, and time of collection. It was a digital firing squad. The final slide was a timeline. 2 decades of silence from my parents. 2 decades of abandonment. Then the sudden reappearance, the legal threats, the manipulative outreach once Dallas's name hit the news. Every step laid out chronologically. Dallas looked back out at the audience, composed. I wasn't raised by them. I was raised by someone who chose me. Someone who built me. Who taught me discipline, clarity, and what power actually means. I don't owe anyone anything just because we share DNA. Applause didn't come immediately. The room was too stunned. But when it started, it didn't stop. It built like a wave, standing ovation, press clamoring for angles, executives turning to each other with raised brows. It wasn't just a tech talk anymore. It was a reckoning. That night, the lawsuit evaporated. My parents' lawyer withdrew within 48 hours. Brandon went silent. The PR firm dropped their contract. Media outlets covered the story as a case study in reputation destruction, corporate manipulation, and legal overreach. Every move they'd made backfired spectacularly. They weren't just humiliated. They were erased from the narrative they tried to steal. And we never said a word to them directly. They had walked into the room thinking they could rewrite history. But history had already been archived, signed, timestamped, and recorded. And we had just played it on a 30-foot screen. The room was still reverberating from the final slide when Dallas took one last step forward on the stage, his expression composed, his hands relaxed at his sides. The applause had finally settled into a deep, electric silence, one of those rare moments where every person in the room felt the gravity of what they were witnessing but didn't yet know what would come next. Then, with the same clarity and steady rhythm he had used throughout the keynote, Dallas delivered the final blow. I'm adopted. You could feel the air shift like a dropped pane of glass. A few gasps rippled through the audience. Executives whispered to each other. Camera zoomed in. Dallas didn't flinch. I'm not their blood. I wasn't born into their name, their money, or their world. I wasn't raised in their image. I was raised by someone who found me when no one else would. Who gave me more than a name, she gave me purpose, discipline, and power. These people who now want to claim me as theirs, they gave me nothing. And they get nothing now. He paused, just for a beat, letting the words settle, then said again, clear, cold, final. They don't get to claim me now. The audience was stunned. The kind of stunned that makes people sit straighter, like they're watching not just a speech, but history being written. Dallas didn't have to raise his voice. He didn't have to yell or posture. The control, the certainty in his tone, carried more weight than 100 accusations. He was stating facts, unchallenged, documented, and final. And then, right on cue, Janice's voice filled the auditorium. She wasn't physically on stage. She had pre-recorded the message from her office, knowing exactly when and how it would be played. The audio was crisp, broadcast through every speaker in the venue, smooth and firm, the voice of a woman who had built empires and buried adversaries without ever raising her volume. Family is earned, she said. Not inherited. Not bought. And certainly not stolen. You could hear a few people gasp when they realized it was her. Janice Miller. The founder of the hotel empire, the woman whose name was carved into buildings and whose net worth had climbed quietly for years without ever needing to be flashy. Her voice carried the tone of someone delivering a verdict. I chose my grandson, she continued. I chose his mother. I raised them both. And I protect what's mine. That's when the room started to shift again. Near the far side of the auditorium, security began to move. Calm, discreet, but unmistakably serious. They weren't part of the venue's staff, they were private, hired through Janice's personal security firm, coordinated by Marcus and cleared with local law enforcement days before the event. They moved through the side aisles, coordinated and professional. And then they appeared, my parents. Thomas and Carol. Sitting toward the back, dressed neatly, faces pale. And Brandon, just a few rows behind them, wearing a blazer that didn't quite hide the nervous sweat collecting along his collar. They had come thinking they would blend in, thinking they'd be seen just enough to be relevant but not enough to be noticed. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected the truth to be weaponized so ruthlessly in front of everyone they'd hoped to impress. The security team approached them silently, each holding identical beige envelopes. Court-issued. Stamped. Certified. Restraining orders. Not just warnings. Legal action. Immediate and binding. Each one named. Each one prohibited from coming within 500 feet of Dallas, of me, of any of our business properties. They tried to protest, Carol rising from her seat, gesturing like she was pleading with someone, Thomas gripping the envelope like he could crush it into dust. Brandon stood up too, muttering something to the nearest officer, but the security didn't flinch. They weren't there to negotiate. They were there to remove. The escort was clean, methodical. No shouting. No drama. Just the quiet, humiliating walk up the side aisle and out of the venue, their backs stiff, their expressions twisted somewhere between rage and confusion. Phones recorded them. Attendees turned in their seats to watch. Their names, their faces, once irrelevant, were now being streamed live to thousands of viewers. Not as part of some proud family reunion. But as the villains in a story they thought they had the right to control. Dallas never looked at them. He stood tall, gaze forward, letting the security team do what they came to do. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He didn't have to. The power wasn't in reacting, it was in staying exactly where he was, above them, beyond them, untouchable. When the last of them had been removed, the room held its breath. Then, applause. Real applause. Deafening, sustained, cathartic. Not for the scandal. Not for the drama. But for the clarity. For the strength. For the brutal elegance of what had just happened. It wasn't a spectacle, it was a reckoning. A full-circle moment delivered not with screaming or revenge fantasies, but with documentation, planning, and complete strategic control. That night, the headlines weren't just about the software. They were about the speech. The truth. The exposure. Teen tech prodigy publicly severs ties with estranged family. Adopted innovator destroys false heirs claims in live presentation. The most brutal 5 minutes in Tech Expo history. My phone lit up for hours with messages from people who had once written me off. Old classmates, distant cousins, even a few reporters who had ignored my pitches years ago when I tried to share my side of the story. Now they wanted interviews. Exclusives. Clarification. But there was nothing left to clarify. The truth was no longer hidden. It had been projected on a 30-foot screen, sealed in court orders, and echoed through every corner of the industry that once would have ignored a girl like me. And all of it was done without me saying a word on stage. Dallas had done that. He had spoken with precision, calm, and truth. And when it mattered most, he made sure the world understood exactly who he was, and who he was not. After the Dallas Tech Expo, after the stage lights dimmed and the security doors closed behind the people who once tried to erase me, everything that needed to be said had already been made public, documented, and carved into memory. But the story didn't stop at their humiliation. That was only part of it. Real revenge isn't just about destruction, it's about what rises after. It's about creating a life so complete, so untouchable, that the people who discarded you become irrelevant even in their failure. I didn't just want to beat them. I wanted to outgrow the world they thought I was too broken to survive in. And that's exactly what I did. Their business began to unravel within weeks. Not because of anything I said directly, but because of the exposure they created themselves. Investors pulled out quietly, not wanting their names tied to a family accused of exploiting a minor for financial gain. Board members resigned. Brandon's father tried to downplay the damage in a local interview, calling the situation a deeply unfortunate miscommunication, but it was too late. Screenshots had already gone viral. Audio recordings had been verified. And then the audit started. It turned out Brandon wasn't just grasping for access to Dallas, he was also lying to the IRS. Ivy had flagged the red flags months ago. Offshore transfers. Undisclosed assets. A suspicious set of investments under a secondary LLC he didn't report on his personal returns. Once his family's legal team started turning on each other to avoid liability, the investigation moved fast. Brandon was charged with multiple counts of tax fraud and financial misrepresentation. He settled, of course. People like him always tried to buy their way out, but the damage was permanent. His reputation was trashed, his name was toxic, and the same media outlets that once ran flattering photos of him during his college years were now labeling him a cautionary tale. As for my parents, Thomas and Carol, they withdrew entirely from public life. Their neighborhood shunned them. Country club invitations stopped arriving. The whispers in their circle grew too loud to ignore. They sold their house within 6 months, under market value, and moved somewhere smaller, quieter. Out of sight. Exactly where they belonged. But that wasn't the victory I celebrated. What mattered more was what I built from the ashes they left behind. I took every memory of being 17 and scared, every cold bench I'd slept on, every humiliating moment where I thought I didn't matter, and I folded them into something permanent. I created the Janice Foundation, named after the woman who had pulled me out of the dark without ever once asking for something in return. The foundation would support single mothers across Texas, starting with shelter, food, and legal aid, then expanding into education, job placement, and long-term support systems. No charity language. No pity. Just power. We launched the foundation exactly 1 year after the Tech Expo, in the same city where I once slept outside cafes and hospitals, where I had bled and broken and almost given up. We held the opening gala at the rooftop of Janice's flagship hotel in downtown Dallas. It was a clear night. The skyline was lit up like fire. Every detail had been curated: black marble floors, soft gold lighting, white roses, and a guest list of women who had been told they were too far gone to matter. Not a single member of my old family was invited. Not one seat was offered to anyone who had ever watched me fall and looked away. I stood at the podium, beside Dallas, now 18, taller than me, hands in his pockets, smirking like he already knew what I was about to do. He had helped design the foundation's tech infrastructure, automated the intake system, created a backend that tracked resources and ensured not a single mother would ever get lost in bureaucracy. He was everything I could have dreamed of raising, and more. And Marcus was there. He had been there through all of it, quietly at first, as Janice's legal counsel, then as my shield, my strategist, my partner. Over time, we had found a rhythm in our silence, a comfort in understanding what it meant to build something from nothing and protect it with everything you had. He never treated me like I was fragile. He challenged me, called me out when I was too harsh, stood beside me when I doubted everything. And he never once used my past against me. So when I turned from the podium that night, with the lights soft and the city behind us, I walked straight toward him. I didn't give a speech. I didn't make it theatrical. I just looked at him, steady, certain, and asked, "Will you marry me?" There was a moment, a small breath of stillness, and then he smiled the way he did when he'd outmaneuvered a courtroom and leaned in close enough for only me to hear, "Took you long enough." Dallas hooped behind me, shouting like a kid again, even though he had already known for days. Applause followed, loud and unapologetic. But none of it was for show. This wasn't a performance. It was the final seal on everything they tried to steal from me. A family I built from truth, from scars, from choice. I had my son. I had the man I trusted with my name, my plans, my future. I had a legacy that no court could touch, no bloodline could rewrite, no last-minute apology could claim. I got everything they said I never would. And they got to watch. From a distance. Powerless. Irrelevant. Forgotten.